All right, so welcome back. Today we covered five current affairs, sharp, relevant, and exam ready. Let's go. So, first of all, we have Iran's new supreme leader chosen. Now, Iran's Assembly of Experts has elected a new supreme leader following Khamenei's death during the ongoing West Asia war. Now, the succession process involved intense factional competition between the hardline Revolutionary Guards commanders and more pragmatic clerics. Now, the new leader's stance on regional conflicts and relations with India will shape bilateral strategic partnerships, including the Chabahar port project. Now, Iran's leadership transition occurs while the country fights Israel and coordinates proxy forces across West Asia. Now, India's relationship with Iran centers on Chabahar port, providing Afghanistan and Central Asia access bypassing Pakistan. Now, the new leadership may recalibrate foreign policy priorities affecting India's strategic interest. Now, India has invested about $500 million developing Chabahar as connectivity gateway to Afghanistan and Central Asia. Now, the port's strategic value lies in avoiding Pakistan for regional trade and accessing Iranian markets. Now, Supreme Leader is the highest Iranian authority combining religious and political power under Vilayat e Faqih. Iran's succession con- constitutional process selecting new supreme leader by the Assembly of Experts. Vilayat e Faqih, guardianship of Islamic jurist governing Iran's theocratic system. India Iran relations, bilateral partnership focusing on Chabahar port and energy cooperation. Chabahar port is an Iranian port developed by India for Afghanistan and Central Asia access and regional stability. West Asia security affecting India's energy and strategic interest. Then we have the India's LPG supply crisis. Now, liquefied petroleum gas supplies face severe disruption as West Asia war halts imports from major suppliers. India imports 55% of LPG requirements from Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar. Now, the current domestic storage capacity covers only 15 days of consumption. Urban households dependent on LPG for cooking face potential rationing as stocks deplete without new shipments arriving. Now, India's LPG supply demands on Gulf countries for imports, supplementing domestic production from refineries. The Strait of Hormuz closure prevents tanker movements carrying LPG from Saudi Arabia and UAE. Unlike strategic petroleum reserves for crude oil, India lacks adequate LPG storage infrastructure. The 15-day storage capacity means supply disruptions quickly translate into household shortages. Now, over 300 million households use LPG as primary cooking fuel, replacing the traditional biomass. The usual scheme provided LPG connections to poor households, enabling clean cooking. LPG supply, liquefied petroleum gas provision for household cooking fuel needs, energy security, reliable access to affordable energy without external disruptions. Import dependence, reliance on foreign LPG supplies for 55% of requirements, storage infrastructure, facilities holding LPG reserves to buffer supply shocks, household energy, cooking fuel for residential use, and strategic reserves, government stockpiles ensuring energy availability during crisis. The next topic is women's political participation remains low. Now, women hold only 82 of 543 Lok Sabha seats, representing 15% of parliamentary strength. The Women's Reservation Act, passed in 2023, promises 33% reservation in legislature, but implementation requires fresh delimitation and elections. Ground level political empowerment remains constrained by patriarchal party structures, limited campaign resources, and social barriers restricting women's political career. Now, despite women com- comprising half the electorate, their parliamentary representation remains disproportionately low at 15%. Now, this underrepresentation means women's perspectives, priorities, and issues receive inadequate attention in policy making. The constitutional amendment mandating one-third reservation was passed out was passed but requires delimitation proceeding implementation. Reservation addresses structural barriers but deeper challenges persist. Political parties give women tickets in unwinnable constituencies or fielding relatives of male politicians rather than independent women leaders. Now, women's reservation representation is female participation in elected legislatures and decision making bodies. Political participation is engagement in electoral politics through voting and contesting elections. Women's Reservation Act is constitutional amendment mandating 33% legislative seats for women. Gender empowerment is enabling women's equal participation in political and economic spheres. Parliamentary seats is total legislative positions across Lok Sabha and state assemblies. And 73rd Amendment is constitutional provision requiring one-third panchayat seats for women. And the next important news is Supreme Court to examine personal data definition. Now, the Supreme Court will examine whether the Digital Personal Data Protection Act definition of personal data adequately protects privacy rights. The petitioners argue the Act's narrow definition excludes non identifiable data that collectively enable surveillance. Now, the case questions whether current data protection network or framework balances individual privacy against state security and commercial data usage interest. Now, the Act defines personal data as information identifying individuals but excludes aggregated or anonymized data. The privacy advocates argue this loophole allows surveillance through data that appears non personal individually but reveals patterns when combined. Now, the government argues national security requires access to aggregated data for threat detection and crime prevention. Commercial entities seek broad data collection for for business analytics and targeted advertising. Unlike European GDPR, with comprehensive data protection standards, India's DPDP Act leaves critical definitions ambiguous. The Data Protection Board's regulatory powers remain untested. Now, personal data is again information identifying or relating to specific individuals requiring protection. DPDP Act is Digital Personal Data Protection Act regulating data collection and usage. Data privacy is individual rights controlling collection and use of personal information. Digital rights is constitutional protection applied to online activities and data. Surveillance is government or commercial monitoring of individual activities and communications. And Data Protection Board is regulatory authority enforcing data privacy rules and investigating violations. All right. The next topic is US Section 301 probe against India. Now, the United States Trade Representative has initiated a Section 301 investigation into India's digital services tax alleging discrimination against American technology companies. The probe examines whether India's 2% tax on digital revenues violates trade agreements and disproportionately burdens US firms like Google, Amazon, and Facebook. If found discriminatory, the US may impose retaliatory tariffs on Indian exports. Now, this is important because India introduced 2% equalization levy on digital revenues from foreign companies operating in India without physical presence. Now, the traditional tax systems require physical establishments, allowing digital companies avoiding taxation despite earning Indian revenues. Now, Section 301 allows the US imposing tariffs on Indian goods if investigation finds discriminatory practices. Now, previous Section 301 tariffs against China reached hundreds of billions of affecting reached hundreds of billions, affecting bilateral trade dramatically. Now, the dispute reflects broader tensions over digital economy, taxation, where traditional rules fail, addressing borderless digital commerce. Multiple countries imposed similar digital taxes, prompting US investigations globally. Section 301 is US trade law enabling investigations and tariffs for discriminatory foreign practices. Trade dispute. bilateral disagreement over taxation and trade policies requiring resolution, digital services tax, levy on technology companies' revenues from digital services in India. Then retaliatory tariffs, US import duties imposed responding to perceived discriminatory policies. US India trade, bilateral commerce totaling about $77 billion in Indian exports annually. WTO compliance, adherence to World Trade Organization rules governing international trade. That's it for today's session. Stay consistent, stay sharp. See you tomorrow. Thank you.